Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, the Honourable Dr. Keith Rowley, members of the Cabinet of Trinidad and Tobago, my fellow ministers from Barbados, members of Parliament from Trinidad and Tobago, distinguished guests, all members of the diplomatic corps. My background is not energy. I say so up front. But my passion is the Caribbean. And it is against that background that I accepted the invitation to speak here today, because there is much conjecture as to what the future of this region holds. Our growth has been anemic at best as a region in the last 20 years. Our financial services sector is being threatened by underperformance and that low growth. And as a result, moves are being made to relocate financial institutions that have populated this region for in excess of a century. It requires self-examination on our part as to how we move at the beginning of this third decade of the 21st century to chart a way that can secure prosperity at best and stability at worst for our people. The projections shared by some in the Caribbean Development Bank are not great and show that without intervention, this region can be one of the poorest regions by 2050. That is the job of those who look only at the data and who do not understand the potential intervention of political will and the will of the people. I have come to Port of Spain this morning because in the year that I was born, 4 leaders of this region got together and determined that there had to be a future post the demise of federation. I've come to Port of Spain because I also lead a political party whose constitution requires of us that regional integration be the objective to which we aspire. But I've come equally conscious that as we have nurtured this integration movement, with the exception of a veiled reference at Article 15 in the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas that asks of COTED, which is the Council of Trade and Economic Development of our integration movement, asks of COTED that they literally promote measures for the development of energy and natural resources on a sustainable basis. The revised Treaty of Chaguaramas is virtually mum on how we treat to the issue of energy. This has been a bugbear for many, and I need not repeat what your chairman of this chamber has indicated or the distinguished Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago spoke to in his speech, that electricity prices and energy prices in the Caribbean have been prohibitive, particularly for those of us who are trying to craft out a way for development for our people. And when you look at the fact that you are meandering between 20 US cents and 37 US cents to be able to produce electricity, no wonder the IMF has declared that this region is one of the regions that has had their competitiveness completely eroded by the cost of energy. It is against that background that this region, as we enter into the third decade of the 21st century, has a duty to do 2 things in particular. One, treat to the issue of accessibility and affordability of energy, both at the level of households and companies, but also as a source of revenue for governments and a potential saver of foreign exchange for governments. And two, to treat to the issue of the absence of access to financing for too many of our regional companies for whom access to finance has become a bad word, largely because of the absence of risk, of appetite for risk by our financial institutions in the region, who believe that they should only undertake projects in the way that a man would wear belt, suspenders, and a hoist to keep his pants up. The bottom line is that we have become as risk averse as it is humanly possible for any region to have before it. And we can choose to accept those circumstances and risk the possibility of becoming that poor region of 2050, or we can choose a different road. A road that was crafted initially by those who understood that the climb back from a region that has been highly exploited and colonized would require of us, first, confidence in our ability to manage our affairs, a determination that our actions be based on principle and values, not just at the level of our leaders, but at the level of all in our society, and a determination that we should be fair to all, but always first fair to ourselves. It is against this background that I believe that the call just now by Prime Minister Rowley is one that we will support entirely, for the issue of energy to be placed at the center of the regional discussions, because for a regional community of sovereign nations in the third decade of the 21st century that now has not just Trinidad and Tobago, but at least 5 countries involved in both hydrocarbon, and all countries at some point or level, at least aspirationally, willing to participate in renewable energy, that to fail to have an appropriate protocol governing how we deal with each other first and foremost before dealing with anyone else in the world is now incumbent upon us. And that is the principle of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, that we treat each other better than we treat anyone else as a third party. That is the principle that has allowed manufacturers here in Trinidad and Tobago to be able to reap the bounty of exports to a region that has been prepared to accept its goods, while not allowing the level of competition from the outside world by reason of the reduced access and duty-free access for Trinidadian goods as compared to goods from outside. It is the reason why Barbados has benefited from an export of services once we moved from Carifta to CARICOM and moved from an area of trade in goods to one that admitted trade in services. There are benefits that we give each other. But the form of economic policy adjustment that my government has pursued has been based on a very simple premise, that those who share in the burden must equally share in the bounty. And it is why our own adjustment economically in the last 2 years has been based effectively on sharing the burden between capital and labor, between domestic, regional, and international players. And it is an understanding from a very simple premise that we learned at primary school, that many hands make light work. If we accept that this approach to burden sharing is one that we would want to pursue, and sharing in the bounty, then we begin to understand that there are some issues that we have simply to address. I speak here as a person who was the Attorney General at the time when we pursued maritime delimitation disputes with Trinidad and Tobago. But I also speak as a person who understood that the ability to move beyond that point put us in a place for us to sign the Memorandum of Cooperation in August of last year that we believe is the prelude towards the negotiation of a unitization treaty for the benefit both of the people of Trinidad and Tobago and the people of Barbados. I'm heartened that that is a similar approach being taken by our colleagues in Grenada with the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And I say this because I can say to you that maritime delimitation is not a science. It is an art. And if we accept that it is an art, we need to begin to accept that the adversarial approach within a community of sovereign nations that is supposed to be family is not the one that will bring the greatest economic benefits to our people or the greatest financial benefits to those of our service providers who want to participate. For those who believe that that maritime delimitation remains as a risk, we know how financiers and commercial players treat to the issue of risk. Premiums are literally taken from us in a way that ought not to be, because there is no science equally to the pricing of risk. It therefore means that we can choose to dig our heels in and fight for every ounce, or we can remember that we are family in a community of sovereign nations and pursue approaches that other parts of the world have pursued, such as Australia and East Timor, with the establishment of joint cooperation zones. Norman Washington Manley once referred to the Caribbean Sea as the patrimony of this region. It is up to those of us who are charged with the jurisdiction of our countries to recognize that the only people who benefit from aggressive maritime delimitation programs are lawyers and scientists and not the people of the region. I hope that the courage that both Prime Minister Rowley and myself have shown by the signing of that joint cooperation agreement will mean that others will recognize that this generation of Caribbean leaders is prepared to put first the patrimony of the region and the benefits of our people at all costs. We recognize that in our family there is a player that has virtually a century of oil and gas experience. You cannot make that up. You cannot fabricate that experience. And to that extent, Trinidad starts as a first mover always within the Caribbean community with respect to oil and gas. This region will only mean something if we are prepared to leverage our expertise for the benefit of each other. And in this case, as I've indicated, as we move towards the basin in the Guyanas, whether it be in Guyana, whether it be in Suriname, the reality of that experience is there for all to draw upon. Similarly, the reality of Barbados' experience within the financial services sector, or the reality of engineers from elsewhere in the region, cannot be ignored, because the very revised Treaty of Chaguaramas is premised upon the basis of the movement of our factors of production, the rights of establishment, the ability to move capital. We have not yet perfected elements of it, but we need to move with dispatch so to do. Rights of establishment have to be respected in all forms so that there is a seamless capacity for entities and persons to establish businesses in other Caribbean countries. This is particularly so given the fact that I've referred to the underpopulated nature of the region over and over. This region's greatest problem as we move into this decade, as we seek to turn around what has been anemic growth, is the absence of population and the absence of skills. It is against that background that a number of things will have to play, some of which are not appropriate for me to go into in detail today, such as the establishment of a minimum floor below which none of our citizens should fall with respect to the provision of education and health care. But insofar as we have the capacity to be able to draw on each other's skill base and draw on the fact that this region has $50 billion in domestic savings with excess liquidity and with an inability to draw it down for productive purposes, we need to find the solutions to be able to allow it to work for ourselves and not to see the energy sector purely as one that is driven by foreign direct investment and only to be benefited by governments through taxation and royalties. There is a future for energy in the region. And that energy is both the hydrocarbon industry and the renewable energy industry. In Port of Spain, in December of 2018, we met at the Hilton Hotel and we signed the St. Anne's Declaration, which reflected our commitment for the first time to bring the regional private sector and the regional labor movement into the Conference of Heads of Government, such that they can be major players as we build out the growth prospects for this region. One of the 4 areas identified for immediate involvement of our private sector, which has now established the Private Sector Association and will be sitting at the table formally for the first time since its constitutive documents have been signed in the upcoming intersessional meeting. One of the 4 areas is in the area of renewable energy. We would be fooling ourselves to believe that we can avoid the difficult discussions of our time. And those difficult discussions will be to what extent and in what manner can we allow the hydrocarbon industry to coexist with the realities of climate change. More and more, we are recognizing that it is not a linear discussion, and that there is a role for hydrocarbon companies to play to be part of the solution and not simply to be the bane of our existence with respect to how we have been able to fight these issues. I look forward to our region playing a critical role in what really is a difficult discussion, but an essential discussion. And why? Because it is our countries that are on the front line of the climate crisis. It is our countries that have seen the advent of climate refugees within recent years. It is our countries that may face complete demise, as we have seen with the total evacuation of the people of Barbuda, the total evacuation of the people of Abaco, the complete demise of the economy of Dominica, and God knows who else will be next. Trinidad, Tobago, Barbados, Suriname, Guyana are perhaps a little luckier than most because we are just slightly on the periphery of the hurricane belt. But we are not immune from the floods. We are not immune from the groundwater crises. We are not immune from the other negative consequences of climate change, which are showing themselves to us daily and weekly. I therefore look forward not only to our discussion as to a protocol on energy, but one that reflects our concerns with the climate crisis and one that will allow for a balance with renewable energy. Prime Minister Rowley already adverted to the fact that in my own country, we have had the benefit of solar water heaters since the 1970s, such that it is almost inconceivable that anybody would find a different way to heat water other than through solar panels. But that has not been the reality of the majority of Caribbean citizens. In spite of its clear benefit as an opportunity for investment for many of our local businesses, it has not taken off for whatever reason. In Trinidad, we could perhaps understand because of the high subsidies attaching to the cost of electricity here. But in other Caribbean countries where electricity costs are high, you ask yourself, why has there not been any movement on a matter that ought to be so basic for others to understand? And it shows us that traditionally, our private sector and our governments have not worked sufficiently closely in a strategic way to advance the purposes of national development in areas that can benefit returns on investment for those who are part of the industry. I look forward to that being a significant change in the way that we do business. And the advent of the private sector and the labor movement at the table with the Conference of the Heads of Government should begin to align national interests with interests that have commercial viability and financial returns for our people by allowing us to have direct discussion with each other. I also want to be able to signal that in the same way that we believe that our future as a nation, Barbados, is also capable of being supported by investments in energy, both hydrocarbon and renewable energy, that we have equally to recognize that we need to make these opportunities available to each other. There is no doubt that renewable energy comes from the patrimony of our people. The wind that blows, the sun that shines, the geothermal energy that is available, and who knows what may come with waves and tidal energy in the future with the technological innovations that are being done. It would be a crying shame if the opportunities for investment in those areas do not include ordinary people, ordinary workers, ordinary households. And we therefore need to find creative financial instruments, whether through unit trusts or other instruments, to allow our people to participate in this sector of all sectors. It does not necessarily require the same lumpy investments of the hydrocarbon sector, but it does also create the mechanisms by which our people can understand that they will not, with this generation of Caribbean leaders, be left to be tenants in their own lands. It is our solemn responsibility to make it happen. And the only way I know how to do so is by talking and putting on the table those things which need to be resolved, those things upon which we are united, and those things upon which we are divided. I believe, therefore, as I said at the outset, that the time has come for us to recognize that with the advent of what has happened in the Guyanas, with the advent of what has happened in Grenada, with the advent of what potentially can happen in the Northern Caribbean, that we have now a responsibility for a dedicated protocol on cooperation in energy, be it from energy services, energy investment, hydrocarbons, renewable energy, educated skills, all of the various things that will come to affect the future viability of the energy industry. We speak in this sector glibly about the length of time that it takes to bring wells to production. It's not a bad thing, and it is something from which the rest of our region and our people can learn, because regrettably, too many of our people have become wedded to this notion of instant gratification that now dominates global society. In my own country, I've had to say to my people over and over that we must stay the course and stay focused. Nothing happens quickly in the hydrocarbon industry. And we need, therefore, to use this as a metaphor for our own development. and to recognize that if we set ourselves these targets in early 2020, and if we as a regional community of sovereign nations can agree to the things that are absolutely critical for the viability of an energy sector in the image of Caribbean people, then by the end of this decade, we will have made a major difference to our ability to avoid the notion that this region can become one of the poorest regions by 2050. We have enough going against us. Let us not add absence of political will and absence of action to those things that have conspired to keep this region down. Last night, I witnessed from Panyard to Panyard to Panyard the amazing proficiency, creativity, but above all else, discipline of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. The majority of them were young people. They say young people cannot focus. They say young people are not disciplined. Well, you have shown by those young people in the Panyards that when they put their minds to it, day after day, practice after practice, stay in focus, stay in the course, that the most magnificent sounds can emanate from that cooperation. We would do well to recognize that the Steel Orchestra is the ultimate Caribbean paradox, one that assimilates, one that defies, one that is resilient in that simple action. And we as leaders, therefore, would do well to recognize that all that stands in our way is the will and the ability to take the decisions to act in the names of our people. When Eric Williams, Errol Barrow, Norman Manley, and Forbes Burnham signed in 1965 the beginnings of the modern regional integration movement, they did not know where it would take us, but they had the confidence that they could start a race and pass a baton, and that with each successive generation, that baton would be taken firmly, but recognizing that it must always be held in the image of the Caribbean people in whose name we act. I look forward to the cooperation of this sector, those of you from outside working with us, recognizing that the win-win situation for you and for us lies in this respect. Thank you very much.